Now, the two games that I will be comparing today are Superliminal and Portal, though you could look at its sequel Portal 2 all the same, so I will be referring to those two games synonymously, as well as using examples from both games to best support the points I'll be making. While I won't be going into every little detail of the story or gameplay of any of these games, if you would like to not be spoiled on certain puzzles in the games, or more importantly, some of the more important story moments, then this is your spoiler warning. Now, the concept that I'd like to explore within these two games is that of liminality or liminal spaces, and as a sort of sub-concept, anti-utopias. So let's look at just exactly what liminality is and what that looks like in both of the games. In Irma Ratiani's work called Liminality and the Liminal Theory of Conceptualizing Time and Space in 20th Century Eschatological Anti-Utopia, Ratiani states, the term liminal, deriving from Latin limen, means a threshold or boundary, a corridor between two different places. So, with liminality being defined as a place between places, I feel that Superliminal fits this definition more overtly, as you are quite literally in the main character's subconscious mind, a sort of place between the real world and our conscious mind. Portal, on the other hand, seems a bit harder to fit this basic definition of liminality, as it takes place in a physical world, and one that acts just like our own, but when we look at it in the context of the player being between being controlled and being free, this is where we can see the connection of liminality. In Portal, while your actions are your own free will, they must always eventually result in the same outcome, meaning that even though the player chooses what they want to do next, they're controlled in the goal that all their actions must meet, which is to solve the test chambers and move forward. This difference in how the concept of liminality and liminal spaces applies to each game already shows how the context of each game matters, as even using the same concept on both games leads to a radically different understanding of said concept. But now let's look at the geography and presentation of both games. Further into the concept of liminality, Ratiani begins to discuss the concept of an anti-utopia. An anti-utopia is basically a perfect world on the surface, but is actually filled with misery and horror. We can see more easily how the idea of anti-utopias relate to the concept of liminality when Ratiani writes, anti-utopia takes into account not only the empathical, totalitarian, industrial, and pragmatic presence, but its tragic consequence, the total alienation of the personality from the world and his striving for self-localization. And when we look at both Portal and Superliminal, the idea of an anti-utopia becomes very apparent. Both games have idealistic and perfect looking rooms that seem like they haven't even seen the touch of man, and for that reason they feel so lifeless and devoid of any personality. Portal's white and gray tiles that build not only the walls and ceilings, but even the floors begin to make everything blend together. The same goes for Superliminal, as each room looks like the perfect art gallery, coated with a soulless white paint, feeling beautiful yet lifeless at the same time. Furthermore, Superliminal uses many objects and designs that we all see in our day-to-day lives, such as fire alarms, alarm clocks, or chess pieces to make everything far more familiar. But when we mix the familiar with the soulless color palette and the lack of any other characters to physically interact with, it can almost give a sense of unease as everything just feels a bit off. These unsettling vibes are only heightened when in both games you find a way to get behind the boundaries of the puzzle rooms and see the back rooms. These sort of behind-the-scene areas stand to make the player feel as though they're on some sort of set where people watch and control from behind the walls of each and every room. When the player exits from the main path, aka just sticking to the test chambers, the music cuts in both games have an ominous droning sound that plays when you're in these backroom areas to add to the feeling that these are places that you're not meant to be, and this rather simple sound effect adds so much ominous tension to these areas. This aspect alone feeds into liminality and anti-utopia, as these back rooms are between two worlds, that of the puzzle rooms and outside, and the way in which both games craft an anti-utopian environment leaves the world devoid of any personality for the player to grasp onto, and the backrooms hint at something more sinister going on. So next, let's look at each game's story and the ways that they further the liminal and anti-utopia concepts. Both games' stories and worlds can best be summed up when Ratiani states, "The theme takes shape of a negative character locked up in the depth of a hypertrophied, hazardous world who is looking for salvation." And so first, I'd like to look at Portal's story. In Portal, we play as a random test subject at Aperture Labs named Shell. The entire lab seemed to be devoid of any other sentient life except for Shell and the egotistical GLaDOS, which is a sentient AI that controls the entire facilities and makes the test chambers the player traverses. GLaDOS starts out rather friendly and helpful, but quickly begins to show her true colors as she actively tries to demean Shell and therefore the player, as well as set up death traps to kill the player. Aperture Labs starts out feeling rather sterile, but utopic, until the cracks begin to show and everything goes from feeling utopic to rather off-putting and ominous.
This plate must not be calibrated to someone of your generousness. I'll add a few zeros to the maximum weight.
To further this feeling, if the player goes to a few of the more secluded portions of the test chambers, they can find graffiti and scribblings of a madman called the Rat Man, who may have once been in a similar situation to that of the player, and he may even still be in the testing facility with you, lurking in the dark corners of the chambers. It's this thought of another person being in there with you that should be your comfort, as there's finally another life form to have physical contact with, and yet it only goes to make the facility feel more unsettling and nerve-wracking. In reality, no proof of the Rat Man actually existing has ever surfaced, but it speaks to the effectiveness of these areas, since there are still people that believe that the Rat Man is in the game and can be found. The nature of the test chambers and the isolation that they put the player into almost has people beginning to get a sort of cabin fever, and with that comes paranoia and irrational decisions, and it's in these little moments when we're able to peek past the curtain of the perfect that the player truly becomes detached from this utopic reality and is forced to confront some of the harsher realities that shatter the utopic image they once had, leaving them in a sort of limbo, not knowing what to believe anymore. Now finally, let's look at the story of Superliminal. In Superliminal, you're completing tests not too dissimilar to the ones in Portal, except instead of being in a lab with an evil AI, you're in the main character's mind as a rather calm psychologist talks to you periodically to guide you. Similar to GLaDOS though, this calm demeanor begins to change at a point as the possibility of someone or something else being in your mind becomes apparent as concerning messages and what seems to be blood are left everywhere. This shattering of the utopia that had been crafted and maintained up until this point begins to cause rather abrupt changes in reality as time and space distorting further as the player is moving through the world in rather unnatural ways as hallways distort, go on seemingly forever, or doors lead to places they logically shouldn't. This new reality not only quickly becomes far more terrifying, but also leaves the player's mind spinning as they no longer know what to expect from the reality that the game had crafted up until this point.
Hello, name is my Pierce Dr. Glenn. To the Somnosculpt Welcome Experience, team of your care leader patient years 10 development. Conditions struggle you whatever with? Professional invention. Edge science with cutting, a tomorrow can bright. And buts, no ifs or? Look good.
This change in the way the player perceives the reality of the game world perfectly reflects that of liminality, as can be seen when Ratiani writes, "Thus, the liminal phase constitutes an intermediate, transitional, ambivalent, neither hither nor thither condition in which the individual separates from the normative context and, through transformation, creates an oppositionally contrary world." So, as we can see, liminality and anti-utopia have been woven into every aspect of both of these games, but it's in this context in which we look at them that gives them new meanings and ones that are unique to each game. This is no more apparent than the fact that while both Portal and Superliminal are very similar in their game structure and flow, it is important to remember that the original Portal came out over a decade before Superliminal, and without it, Superliminal likely wouldn't exist at all.